It was the final week of the Field Leadership Reaction course at West Point. The time when every cadet's composure and judgment were pushed to their limit. Inside the temporary mess tent, pitched on the muddy training ground, the air was thick with sweat, damp nylon, and exhaustion. It was just after 12:30 p.m., and the cadets of Spartan Company sat shoulder to shoulder at long folding tables, tearing open brown plastic MRE packets and shoveling down calories like soldiers who had forgotten what real food tasted like. Every movement carried the tired rhythm of a week spent running drills in the cold, the constant grind of leadership evaluations, and the knowledge that only a few days stood between them and graduation. Cadet Captain Ryan Thorne moved through the rows of tables like he owned the place. His uniform was streaked with dirt, but his posture was perfect, his confidence unshaken. To him, this tent was his command post, and every cadet who sat under its canvas roof was a reflection of his leadership. That was when he noticed her. At the far end of the tent, a woman sat alone, eating in silence. Her gray polo shirt, khaki cargo pants, and plain contractor badge made her blend in with the background noise of military logistics. Yet there was something about the way she sat, upright and still, that pulled attention toward her. She had chosen one of the company commander seats. In front of her was an MRE menu 17. Beef stroganoff with noodles. One of the few meals cadets actually fought over. She ate slowly, methodically, as if each spoonful had a purpose. Around here, conversation began to fade. The cadets who recognized Thorne's glance at her could sense a confrontation brewing, the kind of moment that could either break the tension or light the tent on fire. Thorne's jaw tightened. He approached her, boots thudding softly on the plywood flooring that had been laid over the mud. When he reached her table, he spoke in the tone of a man who believed his rank meant authority, not responsibility. "You're in my spot. Ma'am, those are my rations. I suggest you move." She didn't look up. She didn't even pause. The only sound was the quiet clink of the plastic spoon against the MRE tray. The cadets nearby stopped eating. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered. Thorne waited for her to respond, but she kept eating, her face calm, her breathing steady. He mistook that calm for disrespect. His ego prickled under the silence. In the far corner of the tent, Major General Ivan Wallace, there to evaluate leadership behavior during the exercise, lifted his head from his notes. He watched the young cadet captain square his shoulders. His authority being tested in front of his peers, the general's eyes moved to the woman. Her posture was disciplined, balanced, and aware. Evan sitting. She occupied space like someone who understood the weight of danger. Wallace leaned back slightly, his instincts triggered by something he couldn't name. Thorne's voice rose just enough for everyone to hear. He gestured at her tray with his chin. "That meal's meant for the company commander, not a contractor." He expected a reaction, maybe an apology, maybe fear. Instead, he got nothing. Her silence wasn't submission. It was confidence so deep it didn't need to explain itself. The muscles in his neck tightened as laughter rippled quietly through the cadets, watching him struggle to control the moment. He felt his authority slipping. His pride couldn't handle it. He reached to his side and unclipped his holster. The bright blue training M17 pistol came free with a clean mechanical sound. The room froze. Even though every cadet knew it was a simunition weapon, not a live firearm. Everyone understood what the gesture meant. It was a line you didn't cross during a leadership exercise. Thorne held the pistol low. Safety off. Barrel pointed toward the ground. But the implication was unmistakable. He spoke again. Softer now. His words sharp. "I'm not asking anymore. Move." The spoon paused midair for just a second before returning to the tray. She finished the bite, chewed once, swallowed. The silence pressed in like a weight. General Wallace's hand stilled above his clipboard. He saw the set of her shoulders, the alignment of her feet under the table, and the tension in her hands that wasn't fear but readiness. He had seen posture like that once before, in a briefing room full of special operators preparing for missions that didn't exist on paper. He exhaled slowly, realizing this was no ordinary contractor. Something was about to happen. And every instinct told him the young cadet was seconds away from learning a lesson that would follow him for the rest of his life. The silence shattered with a scream from the loudspeakers that made the canvas walls tremble. The siren wailed, long and mechanical. Cutting through the stale air of the tent, code red, active threat on base. This is not a drill. The words echoed across the field site at precisely 1:20 p.m. And in an instant, the world inside the mess tent exploded into motion. Benches overturned. MREs hit the floor. Dozens of cadets jumped to their feet, some ducking instinctively, others shouting for direction that never came. The calm order of a training exercise dissolved into panic. Ryan Thorne still had his blue-barreled M17 simunition pistol in his hand. He froze for a second, unsure whether the siren was real or part of a larger scenario. His brain lagged behind the noise. Then he snapped into motion, barking orders that vanished into the chaos. For na perimeter. Spartan Company. On me. No one listened. The tent had become a whirl of bodies colliding and shouting. Outside, boots pounded on gravel, followed by short bursts of simulated gunfire from M4A1 simunition rifles. Two figures in black tactical gear appeared through the open flap, faces hidden behind goggles and helmets, rifles shouldered. Moving with the precision of men who lived for controlled violence, they were instructors from the 75th Ranger Training Battalion, assigned as OP4 for this phase. They cleared corners with mechanical ease, rifles scanning the crowd, their voices sharp and clipped. Everyone on the ground now. The sound of their weapons firing 3-round bursts into the ceiling filled the tent like thunder. Thorne raised his pistol. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it over the chaos. He aimed at center mass, squeezed the trigger, and heard nothing but a hollow click. Empty. He had fired his last simunition round earlier that morning and had forgotten to reload. The instructor's head turned toward him, the reflective lenses of his goggles locking onto Thorne like a predator spotting weak prey. Thorne's stomach dropped. The blue pistol in his hand suddenly looked like a toy. The ranger lifted his rifle, ready to drive the cadet to the ground. But before he could move, the woman at the far table did. Evelyn Ross set her spoon down beside the MRE tray. Her chair barely shifted as she rose. In a single controlled motion, she stepped toward the approaching instructor. Her right hand caught the sling of his M4A1 just below his shoulder, using his own forward movement to pull him off balance. She twisted the sling tight, pressing it into the soft tissue near his neck, while her left palm struck up under his jawline with the precision of a hammer blow. The impact snapped his head back. He hit the ground hard, choking but alive, weapon falling free. The second instructor reacted fast, raising his rifle, but she was already crouching low, scooping up the fallen M4A1. Her movements were efficient, not frantic. She toggled the safety to fire and rose from her crouch, firing 3 simunition rounds in rapid sequence. The first struck the second ranger's rifle, knocking it aside. The second shattered the microphone attached to his headset. The third clipped the buckle under his chin, sending his helmet spinning across the floor. The room went still. The air hung heavy with the faint smell of burnt plastic from the training rounds. Dozens of cadets stared, their faces caught between disbelief and awe. Evelyn Ross stood in the center of the tent. The M4A1 held low, her breathing calm, her eyes steady. Around here, time seemed to stop. The woman everyone thought was a maintenance contractor had just neutralized 2 elite ranger instructors before anyone else had even processed the threat. The tent was silent. The kind of silence that settles after something no one can explain. The first ranger lay on his side, one hand at his throat, trying to catch his breath. The second stood frozen, unarmed, his helmet gone, his rifle on the floor. Evelyn Ross stood between them, her stance balanced. M4, A1 simunition rifle held low, safety engaged, muzzle pointed safely toward the ground. She wasn't breathing hard. She wasn't smiling. She looked as calm as if she had just finished a training drill, instead of dismantling 2 elite instructors in front of an entire company of cadets. Around here, time seemed to have stopped. Dozens of cadets stayed rooted to their places, hands still on tables, eyes wide, faces pale. Their minds scrambled to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The woman who had been silent through humiliation had just taken control of the room without saying a word. The noise of panic and movement that had filled the tent only a minute ago had vanished. What replaced it was respect. Raw, unfiltered respect mixed with disbelief. The first sound to break the silence was the creak of boots on plywood. Major General Ivan Wallace entered through the tent flap, followed by 2 aides who stopped just outside. The general's uniform was clean but weathered, his presence commanding without effort. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every cadet within sight straightened instinctively. The stars on his collar caught the dim light, flashing once as he stepped forward. Wallace took in the scene with the quick, scanning eyes of a soldier used to chaos. He saw the downed instructors, the blue simunition rounds scattered across the ground, the overturned benches, and the cadets standing stiffly like statues. Then his gaze fell on her. She stood perfectly still, hands relaxed, rifle slung, eyes calm but alert. There was something in the way she held her weight, how she seemed aware of every movement around her without shifting her focus. He had seen that once before, long ago, in a classified briefing about an operation that officially never happened. He unclipped a small, rugged datapad from a pouch on his vest. It was military issue, black and thick, built to survive the field. He turned it on, the screen glowing a faint green. His fingers moved quickly, entering a command-level authorization code, followed by his thumbprint on the biometric scanner. A few seconds later, he accessed the personnel database of the academy. He typed in her name from the badge clipped to her shirt. Evelyn Ross. The file that came up was thin, unremarkable. Logistics contractor. Low clearance. Nothing unusual. He frowned, then opened a secondary access menu, entered another code, and switched to a restricted system. The new file appeared instantly. The banner at the top read, Classified, Level Alpha a CCSS only. He scrolled down slowly, his expression tightening as he read, 22 years of active service. Mos 18, Special Forces Officer, former member of a special mission unit under JSOC. Decorations included the Distinguished Service Cross, 3 silver stars, and 1 presidential citation marked details classified, codename Specter. Current assignment detached to U.S. Military Academy. Purpose listed as leadership assessment and threat evaluation. Wallace's eyes paused on those last words, then lifted toward her again. He finally understood. He closed the datapad, slid it back into his vest, and stood straighter. His voice came out steady, deep, and full of weight. Ma'am, me apologies. I was not aware you were on site. Then he raised his right hand and gave a sharp, deliberate salute. The gesture cut through the still air like a blade. Every cadet in the room blinked, unable to believe what they were seeing. A 2-star general saluting a supposed civilian contractor. She returned the salute with quiet precision. No words, just acknowledgement. For a moment, the tent felt sacred. Wallace dropped his hand, turned slowly toward Cadet Captain Ryan Thorne, and walked until he stood in front of him. The young man's face had lost all color. His hands hung at his sides. The pistol he had dropped earlier lay forgotten on the floor. Wallace spoke with the kind of calm that carried more power than shouting ever could. Cadet Captain Thorne, you pointed a weapon, training or not, at a command-level asset of the United States Army. You did so to intimidate her. You did so out of pride. You confused rank with respect. You mistook silence for weakness. His voice grew heavier with each sentence. You failed as a leader. You failed as a soldier. The words hit harder than any punishment could. Thorne's throat tightened. His eyes fixed on the floor. The cadets around him stayed silent, their expressions mirroring the same lesson they had all just learned. Wallace let the silence stretch, then looked back toward the woman. She had already slung the rifle and stepped aside, making space for him to pass. He nodded once. She nodded back. The general turned toward the exit, his voice quiet but clear. Class dismissed. The tent stayed frozen as he walked out. Only after he was gone did the cadets begin to move again, their faces still pale, their minds still trying to absorb what had just unfolded. No one spoke. No one dared to. In the heart of the silence, one truth remained. The woman they had ignored had just become a legend. The story of the salute traveled faster than any official report ever could. By the next morning, every cadet at West Point had heard about it. They whispered in hallways, in the barracks, and out on the training fields. The phrase kept surfacing like an echo they couldn't escape. The Specter's lunch. Some said it was because of how quiet she was. Others said it was because she appeared and vanished like a ghost. No one ever saw her again after that day. But the story grew in strength with every retelling. Inside the mess tent, the corner where she had sat became something else entirely. No one touched it. No one dared to. Even when space was short during mealtime, that seat stayed empty. A few cadets would glance at it as they passed, remembering the moment a two-star general had saluted a woman they'd mistaken for a contractor. It became an unspoken shrine, a small monument to humility and silence. Ryan Thorne stopped trying to sit anywhere near it. The cadets who had once followed him now avoided him, unsure of what to say. His reputation, once built on confidence and authority, was gone. In its place was a quiet that followed him everywhere. He still wore his rank, but the weight of it had changed. Every word he spoke in formation carried a hesitation that hadn't been there before. He ate his meals alone, at the far end of the tent, staring at the tray like it might hold the answer to everything he had done wrong. Life at the academy went on as it always did. Mornings began at 05:30. Days blurred into drills, cleaning, and the endless cycle of classes and evaluations. At night, the campus lights glowed dim across the Hudson, and the sound of boots echoed through the corridors as cadets returned from duty. Thorne spent his nights in the armory or the motor pool, doing small tasks no one assigned to him, cleaning rifles, stacking here, trying to quiet the storm inside his head. One evening, close to 2100 hours, he found her. The maintenance bay was mostly empty, the air filled with the sharp metallic smell of CLP oil and diesel. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. She sat on a small folding stool beside a workbench, disassembling an M4A1 simunition rifle with slow, deliberate care. Her movements were smooth, precise, and quiet. She laid each part down in perfect order, her hands steady. Thorne stood in the doorway for nearly a minute before stepping inside. He wanted to speak, to apologize, but words felt useless. She didn't look up. Instead, he walked to a corner where a stack of heavy sandbags waited to be moved. They had been left behind from a previous exercise. He bent down, lifted one onto his shoulder, and carried it to the far wall. Then another. Then another. The repetitive motion grounded him. Each trip left him more exhausted, his arms trembling, sweat soaking through his uniform. When the last sandbag was in place, he turned toward her. She was reassembling the rifle, checking the bolt carrier group and sliding the upper receiver into place. The sound of the closing latch was the only thing that filled the air. She wiped her hands with a clean cloth, then finally lifted her eyes toward him. There was no anger in her expression, no pity, only understanding. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the same weight it had that day in the tent. Assumptions are heavy. Cadet. Travel light. She stood, slung the rifle over her shoulder, and walked past him toward the exit. He didn't follow. He stood alone in the hum of the maintenance bay, surrounded by the smell of oil and the faint echo of her footsteps. The lesson settled into him slowly, heavier than the sandbags he had moved. It wasn't just about the mistake he'd made, it was about everything he had built his identity on. The noise, the pride, the need to be seen. He realized then that silence, not words, was the real measure of strength. From that night forward, Thorn stopped trying to prove himself. He learned to listen. He learned to see, and though she was gone by morning, her presence stayed with him in every command decision. Every moment of hesitation before he spoke. The Specter's lunch had ended, but its shadow lingered, teaching him that true respect was never demanded. It was earned in silence. 5 years later, the desert sun in New Mexico baked everything it touched. The heat shimmered above the dust, turning the horizon into a mirage of movement. Captain Ryan Thorn walked the line of soldiers during a field rotation with the 75th Ranger Regiment. His uniform was faded, sleeves rolled, face lined with years of work that had burned away every trace of arrogance. The cadet who once demanded respect had become the officer who earned it quietly. He had passed Ranger School, led men in places that didn't appear on maps, and learned that leadership wasn't volume, it was presence. His platoon was setting up a temporary command post outside the training range. The air was filled with the metallic sound of antenna sections, locking together, and the soft thump of boots on hard sand. Thorn stopped near a group of new lieutenants, observing without a word. Among them was Lieutenant Hayes, young, sharp, and restless. He had the same swagger Thorn once carried, that confidence that came before understanding. Hayes was chewing out a private for misaligning a radio mast, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. The private stood stiff, shoulders tight, too afraid to respond. Thorn watched the scene unfold, the officer's ego bleeding into every word. He didn't step in, he just noted the look on the private's face and the silence from the others. That night at 1900 hours, Thorn sat in his tent with a dim lantern casting a soft yellow glow across the canvas walls. Outside, the desert wind moved across the camp, carrying the distant sound of generators and the faint chatter of soldiers. When Hayes arrived, he stood at attention, unsure why he had been called in. Thorn gestured for him to sit. The younger officer hesitated, then obeyed. Thorn spoke slowly, his voice even. He said he wanted to tell a story that wasn't in any manual or after-action report. He started at the beginning. A mess tent during a field exercise at West Point. A quiet woman eating an MRE in silence. A young cadet captain who mistook stillness for weakness. He told Hayes about the siren, the Rangers, the blue training weapons, and the chaos that turned into silence. He described the salute that changed everything, the general, the legend, and the moment he learned the difference between power and presence. When he got to the part about her name, he paused. Specter. He told him she wasn't in any file anyone could find. She had been there on assignment. teaching a lesson the academy couldn't write into its curriculum. Then he leaned forward slightly and said the line that had shaped his life. The most dangerous person in the room is never the loudest, it's the quietest. Hayes didn't speak. He just sat there, watching his captain, realizing the weight of what was being passed down. Thorn reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone. He turned it over in his hand before setting it on the table between them. He said it was a reminder to stay grounded, to travel light. That arrogance, assumptions, and noise only made a soldier heavier. When Hayes finally asked what had happened to the woman, Thorn looked at the lantern light flickering against the canvas and said she was gone by morning. No record, no trace, just a story that stayed with those who were willing to listen. Hayes nodded slowly. Something in his face had shifted. He understood. As he left the tent, Thorn sat in the quiet, listening to the wind move across the sand. He could still see her face in his memory. Calm, steady, untouchable. The legend of Specter was never about mystery. It was about mastery. He touched the stone again and smiled faintly. The principle lived on, not in words, but in every soldier who learned to lead without needing to be seen. Before dawn, the desert was still. The sky hung low and pale over a special forces team as they moved across the sand in silence, their steps synchronized, their gear whispering against fabric. No one spoke. Each motion was deliberate, rehearsed 1,000 times before. The world would never know their names, but their precision would change it. Not with noise, not with spectacle, but with quiet, flawless execution. Miles away, under the fluorescent glow of a hangar, a pilot ran his hand along the wing of an A-10 Thunderbolt II. His checklist sat folded beside him, edges frayed from years of use. He checked every bolt, every control surface, every panel. His mind focused on the weight of the mission that lay ahead. When the engines finally turned, the growl of the twin turbines was not a declaration of power, but a promise kept through discipline. In an empty armory, a technician sat alone at a workbench, cleaning a rifle. The smell of solvent hung in the air, faint and sharp. He moved in silence, inspecting the chamber, wiping each part until it gleamed. His hands were steady, patient, practiced. For him, it wasn't just maintenance. It was ritual, a quiet devotion to doing things right, even when no one was watching. At a forward operating base overseas, a young lieutenant leaned over a map lit by a single red light. He traced routes with his finger, adjusting his plan again and again until every contingency felt accounted for. Outside, his team rested, trusting him without question. He didn't raise his voice, didn't seek attention. Leadership, he had learned, was not about being heard. It was about being right when it mattered. These moments, scattered across the military world, shared a single truth. The real strength of the uniform lay not in volume or pride, but in quiet mastery. The quiet professionals of the United States military didn't chase recognition. They built their legacy in the shadows, through competence and humility. Their pride lived in precision, not applause. Captain Ryan Thorn had become one of them. Years after the mess tent and the lesson that reshaped his life, he trained his soldiers to value silence, to measure their worth, not in words, but in deeds. In the rare hours between missions, stories of Specter still circulated. They were told over black coffee, whispered during late-night debriefs, shared by those who understood what true strength meant. It wasn't a ghost story. It was a standard. Thorn kept a small stone in his pocket still, smooth from years of touch. It reminded him of the principle that saved him from himself, the one that guided every decision he made since that day at West Point. The story of Specter would never be written in official records, but it lived on in those who led with quiet conviction. As the wind swept across the desert, the narrator's voice faded into stillness. Assumptions are heavy. Travel light. The screen went black, leaving only the echo of silence. And with it, the weight of respect for those who served without needing to be seen.